everything is about chess. So here we were talking about how to approach this position. And since we're talking visualization, when the position went away, you were of course all thinking about it blindfold. So approach from black in this position. And we talked a little about the basic approach already. I think I'm through your phone, Callie, by the way, so don't mess too much with it. So the first thing we do in any situation is we have impulse control. We don't do anything we don't have to. And in this position, your opponent sacrifices a piece with knight b5. The first thing you do is you slow down. So at the moment, I'm not sure if I'm logged in, which is a strange feeling. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good, I can see the chat now. Good, you can hear me, great. So Surya, no more messages in the Q&A, put them in the chat. Good, so here we calm down. So we can talk about candidate moves first. So we should consider what are our options and what are the critical options and what are the options that are more based on evaluation. So at the moment, white has sacrificed a piece. So one of our first objectives should be to find out what his intentions is behind this sacrifice. If we retreat to b8, as being suggested, white will play knight d6. And he will take one of our bishops. And for the rest of the game, we will have this slight positional disadvantage. No way around it. So this would be a concession. But first we need to find out, of course, what happens if we take on b5. It's our opponent's idea. This is the first thing to find out. He's sacrificing a piece. What is his intention? So Vatsal is coming with a full line here, which is c takes b5, c takes b5, knight c5, knight d5, hitting everything. Knight takes d5, rook takes c5, bishop e6, and bishop takes e4. We can continue this variation a little bit longer. Black can play bishop b6, and then white plays rook takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, and here white has a very strong compensation for the exchange. The game would go on, white has 2 pawns for the exchange, and probably a little bit better. So this is definitely a critical line. Variation. We would try to see if we can find any alternatives anywhere. So after cb5, cb5, we should first look for alternatives here. For example, we have knight b8. What happens after knight b8? Correctly pointed out, knight takes e4. And then there are various things that can go wrong for black. Knight takes e4, rook takes c7. And the two bishops will be very strong. Black is very passive. Today we're doing this without moving the pieces because we're talking visualization. So there's another suggestion here. I'm not sure about these rook takes c8 combinations. Black plays knight d7, and I'm not sure the pawn is so great to win. But there are many options. Like bishop takes f6 and rook dc1. So the variation we're talking about is cb5, cb5, knight b8, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, rook c7, knight f6. And here I would think that bishop takes f6, gf6, and rook dc1 would be very unpleasant for black. Must play knight d7 and bishop takes b7, and the rook comes in on the 7th rank. It's not totally over, but it's very bad. It's been suggested cb5, cb5, bishop g4. I think after b takes a6, white has won back the piece, but black has all the problems he had before. After cb5, it seems we have to go knight c5. And then white's idea is knight c5. Knight e4 doesn't work the same way anymore. This time it just gives away a piece. At the end of the line, black will have an extra piece. So knight c5, knight d5. And here we look for alternatives again, but we won't find any. For example, bishop b6, bishop takes f6, and the position disintegrates. So we have to play knight takes d5, rook takes d5. And here we look for, knight takes d5, rook takes c5. And here again we look for alternatives. So at this point we're after cb5, cb5, knight c5, knight d5, knight takes d5, rook takes c5. So f3 has been suggested. And after e takes f3, you say bishop e6 then f takes e4, and you're still hanging on c7 and d5. For example, bishop b6, e d5, bishop c5, d takes e6, followed by bishop d5. It looks more or less winning for white. So people are now suggesting f3 followed by e3. So we're again after knight d5, knight takes d5, rook c5, f3, e takes f3, and e3. Now, if f takes e3, we have time for knight takes e3, attacking the rook, and we get time for bishop b6 or knight takes d1. Either way, black will be a piece up. So we have a question here from Galina. Can you please move the pieces? I cannot really see the position. No. The session today is about visualization. It's about training to see the position without moving the pieces. I understand it's challenging. And when we're doing training, then it's important for us to challenge ourselves, to do things we don't do well. And that's the reason for not moving the pieces. So try to follow the variations. Don't try to actually look for extra moves and these kind of things. Just try to see if you can find out where the pieces are and try to go over the variations again and again if you have to see the positions clearly in your mind's eye. That is the training. For those who are better at visualization, we're training the possible moves. For those who are less strong in visualization, today we're training simply following what is being said. I hope that makes sense to you. Chess is difficult. It will always be difficult. You will always feel challenged. There's nothing wrong about it. You should never feel insecure or in any way embarrassed about it. I'm saying this not because I think you are, but because sometimes people are, and I always think it's very important that we don't limit ourselves in that way. So the variation is cb5, cb5, knight c5 for black, white knight d5, black knight takes d5, white rook takes c5, and now the suggestion is f3, e takes f3, e3. Of course, a very relevant move to suggest here is rook c takes d5. Now the material is equal. So what is your intention, guys? And Vatsal has found the continuation. I know some of you may be struggling a little bit because it's a slightly long variation, but it should be within reach of most. These kind of raised hands and using the Q&A, I would prefer if you don't do it, if you just use the chat and you just say all panelists, which in this case is just myself. You can ask me questions there and I will reply. So I'll just repeat the variation just to be friendly. C takes b5, c takes b5, knight c5, knight takes d5, rook takes c5, f3, e takes f3, e3, rook c d5, and here we were looking for options for black. So there's a suggestion of bishop b6, but white can play f takes e3, and as far as I can see, he's just a pawn up. So Boris has found the right move. Can you give the reply? Srinat also the right move, but what is the next move? You probably see it. It should not be so complicated once you have the right idea. But if you don't have the follow-up, so if some of you feel very challenged today, yes, Boris, if some of you feel very challenged today, Lakish, I'm not sure what the last move you wrote there is about. If some of you feel very challenged today, you should not despair. This is all part of the plan. But it's also a chance for you to see what good visualization would look like. So Galina, you're suggesting take on f2 and bishop b6 check, and white has bishop d4. So I'm gonna, can everyone else hear me here? It seems one person cannot hear me. Good. So let's go through the variation here. If c takes, knight c5, there are many other moves here that could be analyzed, but this is the critical line as we established. Not me who knows the solution, but you guys. Knight d5, knight takes, the rook takes c5, and here f3, ef3, e3, rook c d5, and then when we're here, actually, it's probably not so difficult to see bishop a5, and the rook is simply trapped, and black wins. And Adhiban could have seen all this if he hadn't taken on g3 very quickly, if he had calculated. At the end of a variation, if you're not used to this kind of calculation. Now, very long variations like this one, or reasonably long variations like this one, are not that common in calculation. Normally it's shorter things, but they do happen 10 to 20% of the time. I'm not saying people don't see them. People see long variations all the time. Most of the time they're not very important. It's just bad calculation, trying to look at very long variations for no great reason. And at the homework club, from some people, I do receive these very long variations in any position, also positional decisions, where in reality, most of the moves will just be wrong, as in they will not be anywhere near best play. And therefore, we see that generating these long variations will require energy from us, and we will not benefit from it at all. So here I'm just going to go through the variations once more, just to be friendly. And here the big thing is this f3 move. And if takes, then e3. If not takes, then we have many good suggestions here. The whole on d1 and take here e2. And yes, there is not more to say about this. So here, let's go for another position. So we're going to do this more difficult this time. We're going to have less pieces. It's a good thing to work on your visualization from the starting point of less pieces. So I'm going to talk for a minute here or something. And meanwhile, you're going to remember this position. This is going to be your challenge. You're going to try to remember this position. And then we're going to work for 5 minutes where we'll have no position. So here, white obviously is trying to hold a draw. Things are quite complicated. Some variations are long, as so often are in rook end games with few pieces. You get these long variations with small finesses all over the place. So here I'm going to give you another 10-20 seconds. Remembering the piece, the position. Of course, there will be one or two of you who will be cheating by putting up the position on a board. I don't recommend it. We're gonna go very slowly here. So anyway, let's do this. Good, so this is gonna be our board. So I'm gonna once in a while remind you of the configuration of the pieces. And I'm also gonna ask you, where are the pieces? So at the moment we have a pawn on d2. We have a pawn on d4, sorry. White pawn on d4, white king on e3, white rook on a6. Black has a king on b4, pawn on a2, and rook on b2. So here I'm getting a lot of variations from people with d5, king b3. Now after d5, what is the main move? So remember, pawn on d4, king on e3, rook on a6 for white. Black has king b4, rook b2, and pawn a2. So after d5, black has a very good move. So the correct moves are coming in, one after the other. Rook b3 check and rook a3. So that will tell us of the main theme. So I'm sending out the position on the chat. You can ignore it if you want. I prefer you would, but I know that for some of you, it would be good to be able to refer to the starting position. King on e3, rook on a6, pawn on d4. Black has... I probably need to edit that. King on b4, not on king on e2. So we have a first suggestion. White playing king e4, avoiding rook b3 check. It seems very logical. And then there's a variation suggested starting with king b3, which I presume leads to a draw, rather than allowing this rook c4 check as you want. You can also just play king to e5 very quickly. And we know that in these kind of positions, the king and pawn will often draw against the king and rook. So black has to be very careful about how he wins the rook. If he does, he has to do it under favorable circumstances. So first move, king e4. What is the best move for black here? Let's try to find an idea for black. We're doing a blindfold this time. A training or visualization. If you're not sure where the pieces are, you can look in the chat. I wrote it down. But of course, white plays king e4, and now black to play and win. So there is a suggestion of king c4 with the idea of king e5, rook b5 check. I presume I can play king e4 then. You play king b3, I play... if I play d5, you play rook b4 check. And if I play king e6, you play rook b6 check. Rook takes b6, a1 queen. I'm sure this is your idea. Also mentioned is rook e2 check would be simply winning in this position, followed by king takes d4, and black is in control. So you should look at the second time I send out the position. It's a king's on b4. So if king c4 is answered with rook a4 check, king b3, and the rook goes back to probably not a6 but a8, rook b1, it does seem like black has won an important tempo, improved his position, and rook b1 and should be winning. I agree with that. So after king c4, white is facing this big threat of rook e2 check. So he can play king e3. Now we don't have rook b3 check and rook a3 because the king is on c4. Position is still very interesting. We'll return to it, but I can tell you king c4 is not the best move after white king e4. So here looking for options for black. I find that the rook endgames they're incredibly fascinating, and there are so many deep points in them continuously, and many very, very nice tactical points. So here rook d2 is suggested. I think if nothing else, I can play rook a8. And it's not very easy for you to queen the pawn. Potentially king c6 is suggested. I'm not sure in which position that is. So if we go back to the starting position, so there's a suggestion of king e4, rook e2 check, king d5, king b3, king c5, rook c2, I presume king b5, rook c4, with the idea, I guess, of rook b4 and rook a4. But I have rook takes a2, and black should be happy he can take on d4 for a draw. So Jia is onto the right idea. But is not the right square. Now Srinivas has found the right move. So after king e4, black has rook h2. And if white plays d5, then black has which move? We're talking king e4, rook h2, d5, black to play and win. Which move wins? You guess right. So it's cheat. Vatsal, you're not right. You're suggesting rook h4 check, king e5, rook b3, king b3. Now here rook takes a2 and d6, and white makes a very simple draw. Troosman, you're on similar track. I can play king e5, and again I will draw with king and pawn against rook. So the right move is king b5. Black is threatening the white rook. And on the next move comes rook h4 check and rook a4. And this king b5 tempo is very unpleasant for white. So after king e4, rook h2, if white plays something like rook a8, hoping for king b3, or that black will go with his king into the far corner to win the rook, then rather than king b3, black will have rook h4 check, and wherever the king goes, he will get another check, and the rook comes to the a file, winning. So that's the refutation of rook of king e4. So I'm getting a question here. King e4, rook c2. What's the difference? I think one of them is I can play rook a8, as I was saying. You're not actually threatening anything. If the rook's on h2, after rook a8, you have rook h4 check. So that's the difference. Okay. So going back to the right position, yes, it's pointed out what the correct move is immediately. We can only find the right move if we find the flaw in the most natural move, which is king e4. So for that reason, can we have some more suggestions of what the right move is? Jeet, you're right. I'm going to be friendly and set up the position again here. So we have the position here again. So king e4, rook h2. So Václav has also found the right move here. I want one or two more correct suggestions, please. Our intentions were good. Our variation was refuted by rook h2. Okay, so I'm going to proceed here with the right first move, which is king f4. Now if rook h2, we can play rook a8, and rook h4 check, we have king g3. And it's immediate draw. The rook on h4 is hanging. Rook takes d4, rook takes a2. And if on king f4 black plays king b3, white can play king e5, and we're back to where we were. But we should not deal with the most critical lines. So king f4. This time black should play king c4, as we looked at before. And here there's an interesting line that goes of king e4. So let me start from first move because some will struggle. King f4, king c4, king e4, rook e2 check, king f3, rook h2, simply threatening to take the d pawn. So king e4, and here's black's winning move. It's really nice. There are more than one, but the nicest one I like is king b4. And then we're transposed back to the variation we had after king e4, rook h2. So king f4, king c4, we have to play king e3. It's the only move. And then black once again tries with rook h2. And now I would like you to follow me in the variation after rook a8. So king f4, king c4, king e3, rook h2, rook a8. And black plays king b3. If white plays d5, then rook h3, king d4, rook h4, and rook a4. So instead he has to play rook b8 check. Black plays king c2, and white plays rook a8. And now please, everyone, write to me, where are the pieces? Important part of the exercise. Write to me, where are the pieces? So it's after white's fifth move in this variation, which is rook a8. That it's the fifth move is not something you should care about, of course. Galina, you're right, though it's a funny way to write it. Okay, so you're generally following me. Only one mistake, not including rook b8 to a8, but it's still the right position, just at the wrong moment. Good. So in this position here, if we play king b2 check, I play king b2, right, white plays rook b8 check. So black has a better move. How can he improve things? So Yoga cannot hear me. That's not very good doing a session on visualization if you cannot be heard. Can the rest of you hear me? Good. So after white plays rook a8, what's black's strongest move? So there's a suggestion of king b1, and after white plays d5, a1 queen, take, and king d4, will draw pretty easily. The white king manages to get to the c file where it can keep away the black king. Galina is suggesting rook h3 check. That's indeed an improvement. Rather than having the king on a1, we would have the king on a2. So after rook h3 check, king e4, king b2, we have rook takes a2 check, forced because black's threatening rook a3, and king takes a2. And what's white's best try in that position? How should you try to play with white in such a position? Vachal correctly proposes king d5, king b3, king c5. The idea of Trosman is saying king e5. This kind of play loses very simply. King b3, d5, king c4, d6, king c5, d7, rook d2, king e6, king c6. And we can see that the white king is on the wrong side of its pawn. This is shouldering. That's one of the basics of rook endgame understanding. So king d5, king b3, king c5. This is the attempt to draw the game for white. So the pieces at the moment are white is king on c5, pawn on d4, black has king on b3, and rook on h2. And now I'd like you to find the winning plan for black in this position. So I think this was a very good illustration of things going wrong. So what did I say that was entirely false about the position? So let's go through the variation and see what I did that was wrong. This was a happy mistake because everyone just believed me. So the variation we had was king f4 from this starting position which we're watching. King f4, king c4, king e3, rook h2, rook a8, king b3, rook b8, king c2, rook a8, rook h3 check, king e4, king b2, rook takes a2, king takes a2, king c5, king d5, king b3, king c5. And here I incorrectly said that the rook was an h2. Of course, the rook's an h3 because we gave a check there. And nobody pointed out that I was wrong. I'm not sure if I would have made this. I was thinking it's overwhelmingly possible I wouldn't have made this mistake if I was thinking rather than talking. Always find the two are in opposition to each other to some extent. If the rook was an h2, then rook c2, king c3, king d4, king e5 does look absolutely winning as suggested. But if the rook's on the third rank, we cannot both play rook c3 and king c3. So the position is white king c5, pawn d4, black king b3, and rook h3. After rook c3, king b5. You don't really achieve anything much. It's fine. And then you can play rook d3 and king c5, and you sort of have to find the same idea. It's probably technically quite a good thing to include the check. But it's the same idea you will have to find. No, it's not a draw. Black to play and win. So yeah, part of it when we train visualization, we're still training candidates. We're still training ideas. If black plays king c3, then white will play d5, and he will be able to keep the black king at bay, and in the end he can take a knight on d8. And we have a well-known drawing position. The king and knight are close together. Or you can even take a queen because the rook's on the other side. So I'm going to put the position on the board and see if it helps anyone to find the right moves. Yeah. So in this position, rook d3, white plays d5, and the pawn is going to be enough counterplay. The issue here is what we call shouldering. The white king is preventing the black king from participating in the defense. Rook h8 is suggested. Still after d5, white will push the pawn forward. You have to solve the problem of how you get the king. Rook h5, you play d5. So the correct suggestion comes from Galina, king a4. After d5, king a5, d6, king a6, let's see, was that right? Sorry, no, d6, we have rook c3 check. And if king c6, then king a6, and d6 and rook c3 check. That's a new one. I think the chess-based program is unhappy with me in this case. Okay, let's go back to the original position. So who can tell me where the pieces were? Quickly. First one will save everyone. The original position, where were the pieces? Yes, and there's a few correct ones here. White had king e3, pawn on d4, and rook on h6. Black had king on b4, rook on b2, and pawn on a2. And some people are cheating by copy-pasting from earlier and admitted to it. At least when you're admitting to it, you have a sense of humor. Okay, so the correct solution, and we're going to do this blindfold as well, is king f4, king c4, king e3, and after rook h2, the way white can draw is with d5. If black plays king takes d5, we have king d3, and then the king comes over to the a pawn, and there's nothing. And if black plays king b5, white has rook a8. Let me see. I'm probably giving the moves in wrong line. No, rook a8, rook h3 check. And why I was unsure if I'd given the right position was the thing, can't white just play king d2? But no, he cannot, because rook h1 is a well-known trick, winning immediately, rook a2, rook h2. So after, from the starting position, king f4, king c4, king e3, rook h2, d5, king b5, rook a8, rook h3. White plays king d4, rook h4 check, king c3, rook a4, rook takes a4, king takes a4, and king b2. And the draw is held. And I will very quickly put this on the board, and then the class will be over. And I know there's another class in 40 minutes. And I'm sorry about the technical problems we had earlier. In the end, both our desktop didn't go online, and we had to go online with a laptop and a mobile phone. At least that worked. And as I said, king d2, rook h1 is not an option. And white escapes with a draw. So this kind of problems are very good for solving, where you find them in an exercise book. I wrote Endgame Play. There's a lot of positions with a flavor like this, and there are many other books. I'm not going to say that you have to buy my books. I think you should use the books you already have. But you can also work up towards taking positions, exercises with more pieces on the board. Look at the exercise, turn it away, and then think. I think it's a very good way of practicing your visualization. You don't need exercises where the pieces are written down. You can just look at the exercise, and if it's difficult enough, you can close and then think and train solving blindfold, and it will do a lot for you. You will make mistakes, you will have experiences of sitting for 15 minutes and simply looking at the wrong position in your head. And it's like with everything where you're trying to become better at something, you need to practice it. And in the beginning, you will not be good at it. And that's fine. And this is the whole purpose of training. It's doing things we don't do particularly well so we can do them better. And with those basic words, I'm going to end. And I hope some of you will have time to join it in 35 minutes. And if not, then have a good weekend. And maybe I'll see some of you again in Homework Club tomorrow. And again, very sorry for the technical problems. Questions? Should we try any positions? I think you should start positions, endgame positions, where there are not many pieces. If you are struggling, here it's black to play. Otherwise, white to play, d6 wins. Black to play, king b5 draws. White's last move was king b5, king b2. So I think this is, especially for those of you who find this challenging today, I think this is really vital training. You don't have to be like Praggnanandhaa or Karthikeyan or so on, who could see everything dead cold every time in order to play chess well. We have plenty of examples of people who play well without seeing the board clearly. But yeah, I do suggest starting with endgames. And I do suggest always, when you find you have a weakness in one area, work on it, improve. As a question, is it okay when you play chess to always make a natural move? Well, sometimes the unnatural move is the best. So again, don't limit yourself. Good. Take care. Bye-bye.